Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this dungeon commentary video, we will be watching at Waycrest Manor 28 and talking about the dungeon. But first, there's something we need to go over about this place. You might already know this, but Waycrest Manor has a weekly rotation. Every week, the locations that witches will spawn at will follow one of these four patterns. And whenever you enter the area around one of these spawns, one of two random witch types will spawn, either a rune carver or a soul charmer. While rune carvers do a lot of unavoidable group damage, soul charmers are interruptible chain casting enemies that can be more lethal than rune carvers if you are not constantly interrupting them. So, as far as routing implications are concerned, we need to have a plan to be able to kick soul charmer casts should one of them spawn at any of these locations. Though, for the most part, these are not desirable enemies to fight either way. So, we try to avoid them whenever it's reasonable to do so. Still, due to how the dungeon is laid out, we are practically forced to fight a witch in the bottom left hallway, should one exist, and we will need to pass through either the first floor left main room or the kitchen in order to access the basement. In this run, we are on rotation 3, which has a random witch in both the main room on the left side and the kitchen. And we end up fighting both of them in this run, though this isn't the fastest routing option available. But let's get to the actual run. For the first pull, we are opening up with 2 captain packs, while we wait to see what random witch spawns in the main room on the left. We also pulled the far left soul essence so that players can easily run back from the graveyard should that be required. Since we got a rune carver from the random witch spawn, we want to grab the 3rd captain pack since we now know that we have enough kicks to kick all of the captains. If we had a soul charmer, we wouldn't have pulled the extra captain since we wouldn't have done enough kicks to deal with the soul charmer and all 3 captains. As the tank, you are mostly just going to be aiming all of these frontals into a wall from the captains, and there's little else you need to do. Though if there's a soul charmer, they will constantly drop a damage reduction ground zone effect that you will have to move out of. Something I did in future Waycrest Manor runs was to only open with the 3 captain packs, since they are very easy to pull together right at the start of the dungeon, and I did not spawn the extra witch. And this is a lot cleaner since this comp does not have enough kicks to handle a soul charmer and 3 captains at the same time. So I probably should have done that first pull instead, even if it wasn't used in this particular run. As long as a player has a kick cooldown of 18 seconds or less, they should be able to solo kick a captain. So that's going to be most players except for a few ranged specializations. And if for whatever reason you have guards as the last unit alive after the first pull, you can bring them in the witches, and since they only do damage to the tank, they're mostly harmless to bring into the Coven boss. We also had the option of chaining these remaining captains into the 2 guards and solo caster in the corner of this room, but we are planning to use those enemies to bring into the tree boss later since we have an enhancement shaman and we want to give him some damage funneling. On tyrannical weeks, you may also choose to open on the witch boss with bloodlust and full cooldowns rather than doing this trash pack. On any tyrannical week, you can pre-invis before putting in the key and go up the stairs and through the upper right hallway in order to reach the witch boss without spawning a random witch. Our main influence on this fight is what we are kicking and where we are positioning the bosses. The active witch does much more damage with their interruptible casts, but they will only target you, while the inactive witches can target anyone. So as long as you are fine eating a few bolts, putting more kicks on the inactive witches will improve group survivability. That being said, the starter witch will be a lot more annoying to heal up from if you let her bolt you, because of the healing reduction aura, so you may wish to make an exception just for that one. Also, Briar has a physical damage bolt that generally does less damage than the bolts from the other witches after accounting for armor physical damage reduction. So it is generally better to kick the other 2 witches instead. As for boss positioning, we'll generally be looking to stack the bosses on or near Briar, so everyone can cleave and kick them more effectively. This is mostly because Briar is the last witch we are able to move, so we can get them grouped after the orb passes once, if we are moving them to Briar instead of the witch on the right or keeping it in the middle. On the first witch, if you wait a few seconds at the start of combat before using Abomination Limb, then Abomination Limb should still be active once the mind control goes out for an immediate grip on the mind control player. As for the second witch, jumping is considered movement for the sake of keeping stacks on the witch's aura low, and that is probably going to be the easiest way for us to deal with it, and it's a lot more convenient than sidestepping over and over again. For Blood Death Knights in particular, Dancing Rune weapons will always prefer the target you cast them on, should they be alive. So we ideally don't want to cast them on a witch that is about to go inactive on the first time the orb cycles through. And if the orb is about to pass, you might want to cast Dancing Rune weapon on the witch that is about to get the orb, even if it's not vulnerable to damage yet instead. We can also AMS immune the application of the second witch's debuff cast, but this is not overly important either way. Near the end of the fight, I am bringing in a side pack for extra count. It is important that the caster that we are now bringing in is interrupted, because those do have highly damaging random target casts. But with all of the witches dead except for one, we don't need kicks for the boss anymore. Just don't get disoriented by the frogs dying if you are going to do this, since you will immediately drop threat if that ever happens, and if the boss is still active, it can very easily one-shot people with melees. All that being said, even taking two of these casters into the boss at this point should not be very dangerous, and the boss should not live for very long afterwards. And while these two casters will outlive the boss for some amount of time, the frog packs on the side are still pretty decent trash count percentage, so it's relatively efficient to do this pull if you are comfortable doing it. While I wouldn't generally recommend doing this, the first random witch spawn that we had done in the main room on the bottom left first floor is something that you can avoid if you actually hug the corner and go straight outside. And you do have to hug the wall for a pretty good amount of time in order for you to not trigger the witch spawning. On the upside, this lets you avoid the witch, but if anyone has to leave the dungeon to change trinkets for the tree boss, or if someone's walking back from the graveyard, it's really easy for someone to forget that that witch spawn is still there, and they could just accidentally cast it later at a worse time. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're going to entertain doing that. The courtyard itself is all about the Thorn Shapers, which are dangerous chain casting enemies. 2 at a time allows them to mostly be shut down if you split your kicks appropriately, but you won't be able to do much else, and they may still get a cast off every now and then, where only a single caster could be shut down completely. The fires in this courtyard also do a lot of damage to enemies, so if a fresh one spawns near you, you may want to consider death gripping the casters into it to kill them faster. Though these fires do not damage enemies that do not originate from the courtyard. Again, with 2 Thorn Shapers active at a time for the first pull, we are not able to do much else. Just make sure to respect the Thorn Guard because he has a very hard-hitting tank buster, even though not much else is going on in these pulls. As for Matron Brindle, she isn't too dangerous, but she does have a lot of health, so our goal is to try and chain as much other enemies on top of her as possible, without pulling anything overly threatening. I'm also using crowd control to split up the Thorn Shapers near her, so that we are only fighting one Thorn Shaper at a time. For these pulls, there's nothing else to use our kicks on, so as long as there's only one Thorn Shaper, it should never get any cast off regardless of what else we're pulling here. And as soon as the first one dies, then I will look to Death Grip in the second. When considering what raw trash to pull into this, the main limitation is this trash's potential to damage and kill our allies. And the main 2 enemies that can do that are the maggots and the gorgers. In general, 3 maggots at any one time is safe, while 6 maggots at the same time is doable with a lot of AoE crowd control effects. Though 6 maggots is probably something you should try to avoid in general anyway, because it can just randomly kill people. As for the gorgers, we don't want more than 2 gorgers at a time, and you don't really want any maggots in a pack with more than 1 gorgers. In this run, I start off with 6 maggots by the doorway along with a peasant, though I honestly should have only pulled in 3 maggots at a time. They die fast enough that it wouldn't have made a difference anyway and just would have made things a lot safer. In particular, it is very convenient if you are able to pull the 2 Gorger hallway patrol into Matron Brindle, because they have an extremely long patrol and you really don't want them accidentally pulling later on. In this run, I must not have been paying attention because I miss a very good opportunity to pull them, though I may have been concerned about the 3 maggots that would have spawned once the peasant died in combination with the 2 gorgers. This is also a good time to mention that gorgers appear to have a strange bug right now. Sometimes when they leap at players, they will drop threat and start meleeing random people. It is fun stuff. Even better, your nameplates will still show you as having threat on them, even when they are obviously not aggroed on you and killing other people. There isn't much counterplay to this other than chasing them around and taunting them whenever they leap. But yeah, there's only so much you can do about it, and I wouldn't worry too much. Even after Matron Brindle dies, your main goal is just to bide your time as efficiently as possible until Bloodlust comes off of cooldown, and then you want to pull the tree boss as soon as possible in order to make sure you don't lose a Bloodlust in this dungeon. When pulling out trash from Rawl's room itself, the same Gorger rules apply. But we are also somewhat concerned about the steward enemies. There are 3 stewards in total, and they do a lot of tank damage. Just make sure you are paying attention if you are pulling 2 of them at the same time, and you never want to pull 3 in the same pull. One of the stewards also patrols into the kitchen, so you need to make sure that you include him in at least one of the 2 main pulls you are doing for that room. Stewards also have much higher health than all other enemies in these packs. I don't take advantage of it in this run, but you can and should pull maggots from the hallway into the surviving stewards to reduce your total pull count. Because I'm not doing that in this run, I end up having to do one more run at the end, and a pretty risky one at that, probably one I wouldn't recommend. As for this really lame maggot pull I'm doing right now, we have 2 members of our group that are going to go change into PvP trinkets for the tree boss, since Lust is pretty much just coming off of cooldown. And I don't want the time to be completely wasted, so I'm going to at least kill these 3 maggots while we sit around waiting for them to come out. This boss is currently overtuned. They have nerfed it since this video came out, but it's still pretty bad. The Soul Thorns just have way too much health, and sometimes it's just better to completely ignore them, let them time out, or even just let the person die so you can battle res them later. So not really a good state of things, but we'll talk about that when we're engaged with the tree boss. Something I did forget to mention with regards to these maggot enemies, a few of them in particular will have a buff on them, and these guys have a bit more health than the other worms, and they are able to do an infest cast. If this cast ever goes off, you will permanently lose 1 count for the dungeon. So most routes in this place, you'll want to have at least 1 or 2 extra count, just to make sure that a cast or 2 isn't going to ruin things. But it is something to be aware if you've noticed a lot of these casts have gone off for a dungeon run, and you might have to do extra pulls to compensate. Now, you have 2 options for pulling trash into the tree boss if that is something you are looking into. You can either pull this double guard single caster pack into it, where you can, in theory, stop all of the casts from the Runic Disciple since there's nothing else to kick, or you can pull a 3-pack of Revelers from the front left of corner of the kitchen, which are less dangerous, though they have less health, and in this particular run, they are already dead. This makes the trash count effectively free time-wise and potentially gives you more damage on the boss, especially with something like an enhancement shaman, though it does give the boss more burst potential to kill you personally if the ads stay alive for an excessive amount of time, to the point where the boss gains a significant amount of stacks. The tree boss is straightforward from the tank perspective, even if the tuning is a little harsh for the rest of the group. He is just a tank target dummy that slowly gains stacks over time, and you need to prioritize damaging Soul Thorns whenever they can't be immuned by the player in question, assuming you have enough damage to kill them in a meaningful amount of time before they naturally despawn. If I remember correctly, they'll despawn after 15 seconds, though I don't know the exact number on that one. And even though they'll despawn after 15 seconds, the healer's not going to be able to consistently heal someone through that full duration. They'll be able to do it every once in a while, but if you're in a really bad position, it may even just be better to let the player die and to use a battle res and to just make the call that that's going to happen and let it happen. At some point, the boss stacks will get high enough that things will be overly risky from a personal survivability standpoint. So we just want to make sure that we are taking the boss into fire immediately after a Soul Thorn. If a Soulthorn spawns around the same time that you are clearing the boss's stacks, it will probably lead to the player who got Soulthorned dying unless they immune the Soulthorn altogether. Generally, you should look to do this clear after 3 Soulthorns as a general rule of thumb, since the fires are random and don't indicate how much of their duration is remaining. You'll want to take note of where fires are spawning when you're getting close to when you want to reset. You also don't want to push things too much with the stacks because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where one bad string of RNG is going to immediately lead to your death. And while I am trying to reset him after 3 sets of Soul Thorns, I have the ability to live longer than that if I need to, if I make heavy use of all of my defensives. If you anticipate the need to reset him a certain amount of times, you may as well space them out as much as possible, as long as your healer is ready for the AoE damage. Beyond that, this boss is just testing your basic rotational and defensive cooldown management skills. It's also worth noting that the Soulthorn damage does not scale with the amount of stacks the boss has, and the first few ticks of the fire AoE do scale with the boss's stacks, though they don't gain 100% of the benefit of them, since the stacks very quickly drop off while the tree boss is on fire and ticking the group for damage. Now that the tree boss is dead, most of my group, except for the healer, will be leaving the dungeon to change their trinkets back off of PvP trinkets and onto something a little bit more useful. So I use the time to pull these steward patrols so we can get something done in the meantime, or at least make progress towards something. And once my group eventually gets back, I notice the patrolling gorgers by the door, and I pull them in since I missed my chance to pull them in earlier. This pull feels kind of bad, but at the same time, if I had pulled the rest of the room with this gorger patrol, we would have had 3 gorgers at once, which just would not have been ideal from a group survivability standpoint. So cleaning this up ahead of time means that we only have 1 gorger and 1 steward left in Rawl's room. So that isn't anything too complicated. Again, as I mentioned before, in my more recent routes, I'm a lot more aggressive in mixing maggots into pulls that aren't too dangerous, or chaining in surviving stewards into maggots to clean up the rest of the hallway, and I am not doing that here. And honestly, even if I was doing that kind of route in this run, specifically because I have an enhancement shaman in this run, I really wouldn't have been able to do that too effectively. But in most normal comps without enhancement shaman, the steward would have close to half health, and I would be able to kill a little bit more on top of it once everything else has died in these pulls. As for the Piglet and Reveler enemies that are also in Rawl's room, they aren't doing a whole lot in general, which is why I haven't mentioned them up to this point. They technically both have really low-powered tank busters that do some amount of damage to you, the tank, but it's nothing you can feel, so it really doesn't matter how many of those weaker enemies you have in any of these pulls at all. Probably the more significant enemy that I haven't mentioned up to this point that I have actually fought are the peasant enemies and with the maggots. While they don't have a cast that you can interact with in any way, they do have an instant cast random target, single target damage ability that just goes off sporadically. It's almost the same as a maggot spit, except for there's no way you can stop it. So that doesn't really change exactly how you're doing any of these pulls, but it is just something to keep in mind that they do. As for Rawl himself, there are so many maggot pulls in this area that I'd suggest starting with a 3-pack of maggots on him, or ideally a 3-pack of maggots that also includes a peasant. All damage on this fight is avoidable, so in theory you can keep pulling as much trash in this boss as you want. However, I'd suggest not pulling in any more trash once the boss starts spawning waiters, just not to overcomplicate things for the rest of your group, unless you are pulling in trash right before he dies, because at that point there's minimal risk of a complete wipe happening. Keep in mind that you can't leave melee range of this boss except during his tenderize casts, otherwise he will nuke your entire group and probably wipe the pull. In this run, I start with maggots from the kitchen and very quickly chain in maggots from the right doorway once the maggots from the kitchen are dead. But in my more current runs, I pull in a peasant pack from the hallway instead, and I only chain in maggots from the kitchen when the boss is almost dead. I do think that is better as well. Let us touch on the boss's abilities now. His Tenderize cast is always facing a player, but it does near negligible amounts of damage to the tank. However, he can choose the tank as the player that is faces to cast his next Tenderize. So if you want to be a team player, you can stand in his first two casts and attempt to bait the following frontals in the exact same direction so your range don't have to move. Second, he will periodically spawn oozes in certain directions. You will want to pick these up as soon as possible just so they don't melee the rest of your group, but they are not very dangerous once you have threat on them. Outside of the green swirlies that they release on death, which can cheat or kill you if you stand in a pile of them when they're going off. Finally, we have the waiters. If you took Death and Decay Snare for this dungeon, you can do a lot to stall out these ads. It is very easy to hit 3 ads on the right side with the Death and Decay Snare once they start getting close-ish to the boss. Chains of Ice is also an option if you need an additional snare, though you ideally don't want to use that too often just because it costs a rune and doesn't do too much beyond that. Finally, the ads are trying to get to very specific locations next to the boss, which I am taking advantage of. I am always death gripping the ad on the left to the far right side, and even though this ad ends up walking right next to the boss is unable to eat him until he can return back to the left side where he is trying to go. The same tactic can be used on the ad to the right side of the boss when gripping him to the left. Once the boss starts casting Tenderize, he shouldn't be able to eat any ads until that cast sequence is over. So you're generally free to use Abomination Limb as soon as Tenderize starts to go off, even if there's ads still up, because those ads should be dead before Tenderize finishes in most cases, unless there is some weird crowd control in the back that broke partway through and is coming in really late at high health for some reason. Now, because this route didn't aggressively kill maggots with other pulls, I have a dedicated pull that finishes the remaining peasant and maggot packs at the end of the hallway. It's also worth noting that Shattering Bone is capable of pulling faceless maidens from the floor above, which you really don't want to happen since they'll also bring a hunter and some dogs with them, and they aren't even worth any count. So you can either make sure that you are hugging the close wall when setting this pull up, just so you're not close enough to the maidens above you to pull them, or you can set up this pull without Bone Shield active if you are really paranoid. This is just something to keep in mind. In any case, this is another 6 maggot pull that is kind of questionable. Once the 2 peasants die, they will also turn into 6 maggots, which isn't helping, and since I pulled them at the same time, they'll both probably die at around the same time. I have found ways to bake these maggot pulls into other pulls in my higher Waycrest Manor runs that I've run more recently, and I would also suggest that for anyone else watching. But even if someone was left with these packs that they had to kill for remaining packs after killing Rawl, you might want to kind of stagger the peasant packs coming in just so the maggots themselves are staggered, and it'll just make things easier on your group. Also, around this time, your third Bloodlust should be coming up, so you should be looking to just use this on any pull where you can get full value out of it. I wouldn't be too finicky about its usage beyond that, because you do want this up early on the last boss if at all possible. Now, you'll see that we are clearing out the kitchen, and this is so that we can go downstairs from the kitchen side. You'll also know that I pulled 6 maggots on top of this Runeweaver right from the start, but really I could have pulled 3, spawned the Runeweaver, waited for the 3 maggots to die, and pulled the other 3, which wouldn't have slowed down the run at all, and it would have been less risky. As far as the differences between going down the left side and the right side of the dungeon, the left side is faster, but the pull immediately as you get downstairs is more dangerous, while for the right side, you'll have to kill this Runeweaver, which is kind of slow on most weeks. It might be worth going down this side on the weeks where this witch is not here, but once you do get downstairs from the kitchen side, it is a lot safer of a pull once you get downstairs, though. I mean, it's also worth less count, but it's very manageable. There's just a lot less stops involved, and there's one less tank buster on the tank involved as well. So the main things you are looking to pull here are the Thorn Shaper right as you get down, obviously. And you can also pull the Captain from across the way without pulling the Rune Weaver if you use a single target ability like Taunt or Death's Caress. Just make sure that your Ghoul is not active because he can just auto jump to ranged targets as soon as you attack them, and that would aggro the Rune Weaver, and you wouldn't have a good time, especially if you've already pulled Matron Alma, who's going to be the final thing in this pull. If you have the 12-second kick talented, you can easily solo kick Matron Alma, who uses volley slightly more often than every 15 seconds, so sometimes a regular melee kick isn't 100% reliable on that. So 2 of your kicks will be dedicated to Matron Alma and the Captain, and everything else can be used on the Thorn Shaper. This is a very easy pull for the most part, and I could arguably chain Matron Alma into something else down the stairs, but I mostly just don't want to risk someone accidentally pulling the Rune Weaver if I tried to drag Matron Alma downstairs for the first time in this group, even though that would otherwise be a smart thing to do. And particularly with this routing, if you had too many infests go off in the first section, you could pull the Diviner and Soul Essence from the other side of the cellar, and that'll give you 5 more count, which should more than cover any excess infests if that is something that has happened in your dungeon. Now, depending on how you plan on doing this next pull, it can be one of the most dangerous trash pulls in the dungeon. If you fight everything at once, I'd argue it is overly dangerous without a Prod Paladin or Vengeance Demon Hunter, so using long-term crowd control on the Diviner, like we do here, focusing AoE crowd control on the Soul Essence casts as well, it's leaving all of your interrupts available for the Soul Charmer can make this pull a lot more manageable. Otherwise, it's just hard to fully shut down both the Diviner and the Soul Charmer. We save the Diviner to do with the boss, where we have more than enough interrupts to deal with it, and it helps the Enhancement Shaman do more damage to the boss. Though the really safe way of doing this is to probably pull the Diviner pack first, kill the Diviner, and then go into the a Soul Charmer in the middle of the room, though obviously not as fast. You will also notice that we are not going to be killing the Soul Charmer in the back immediately, and we are going to pull the boss first. If you have tons of time and you want to play things safe, you can kill it before pulling this boss, but otherwise you would rather kill it on the boss after Lady Waycrest moves to the main boss arena, or you can kill it with the final trash pack. As for the Diviner, just because you can use any sort of crowd control on it, it's just a lot safer to do on the boss from the start rather than something like the Soul Charmer, who also requires movement. As for Lord and Lady Waycrest themselves, this is a pretty straightforward fight for you again, though that part of that's just due to tuning on the Tank Buster not being all that harsh, though it is a good AMS target. The boss is constantly nuking everyone in the group with damage. There's not a whole lot you can do about that, but if you have a mage in your group, they can kick the boss during this first phase to reduce the damage. When the swirlies come out, they will always target the 3 closest players to Lady Waycrest, which is why I'm trying to tank the boss as close to the edge as possible so the melee can bait these casts and they don't go unranged. It also has the helpful side effect of keeping the melee as far away from the Soul Charmers as reasonably possible, because you don't want that to ninja pull on this boss if you have not killed it ahead of time. Other than that, it's pretty much rinse and repeat on this boss. If you have a spec with you that can very cheaply pick up a Mortal Strike effect, and they can do this if they happen to be leaving the dungeon to swap trinkets after the tree boss. It has a lot of value on this boss. Instead of Lord Waycrest healing up to full health every time, he's instead just going to heal up to around, I mean, it depends how much damage you're doing, but let's say around 70%. It's still a good chunk of damage that you don't have to do to him every time he heals up. So I don't know the math behind how much damage this saves in this boss and how much damage different specializations lose by taking Mortal Strike effects, but it's just something to keep in mind. The ground effect's not something you need to concern yourself with all that much. In a worst case scenario, if someone was stuck right on top of you and they really wanted to dispel it right away, you could pre-AMS it if you happen to have that up, but really, and just make sure that you're giving them enough space so they can clear the circle and keep as much uptime as possible, especially if it's someone in melee. For the most part, that's all you can really do about that mechanic. When Lady Waycrest comes down, she'll stop doing a lot of the random target damage that is happening in the fight, so you're pretty much done with the fight at that point. She'll periodically have a cast that you can kick. 2 melee kicks can take care of it, but this is one of the opportunities too where you can kill the Soul Charmer in the back if you want to, because even those infrequent casts don't really do all of that much, and you can just even cleave down the boss to kill them at the same time at this point pretty safely. Though, if for whatever reason you still wanted to play safe at this point, you could kill Lord Waycrest first just so he stops putting the debuff on different people, because at this point, that's going to be the highest source of damage other than the dot he places on you. But again, that's just really doesn't seem very threatening right now. Now, if you are really playing for time, you do want to do the Soul Charmer on top of these two bosses rather than with the next trash pack, because if you need the fastest time possible at this point, you don't really have time to do a dedicated trash bowl. You would instead want to take the next trash and pull it all onto the final boss, which that does have some amount of danger attached to it, mostly because the random leap damage from the ads can make someone dip low right before a big boss AoE and potentially lead them to die. And it also splits your target cap damage, so the natural boss ads themselves during the encounter won't be dying as fast while all of these risen horrors are up. But in this case, we have plenty of time. So I'm just doing a dedicated trash pull with the Soul Charmers and with all of these other guys. So nothing too dangerous here. We have more than enough kicks to shut down the Soul Charmer, and the leap damage alone isn't going to be very frightening. If you are pulling the final trash pack up to the boss arena, a well-placed Death and Decay can aggro all of them pretty reliably, especially if you place it down before all of the trash leaves the cave, just so social aggro can work in your favor if you don't get the positioning right to hit them all, the Death and Decay itself. Beyond that, just making sure to be moving everything out of candles whenever they're put on the ground, just so it dies quickly. Just get a good kick rotation down on the Soul Charmer, and there's really nothing to fear on this bull at all. Back in BFA, these mobs used to have an insane magic damage tank buster, which they could all sync up at once. And they also used to be able to all leap at the same time, and it was so fast that it was pretty much undodgeable, making them extremely dangerous. But now they're one of the easiest trash packs in this dungeon. Also, if you do notice that you are missing count from Infestcast going off earlier for whatever reason, the easiest way for you to fix that at this point is to talk to an NPC after you kill the final boss to teleport back to the entrance of the dungeon where you can kill some of the soul essences in the lobby. It is not worth backtracking at this point at all, because anything you could kill up in the cellar is going to be a lot more walking distance and take a lot more time to kill. As far as Gorok Tool, he is pretty straightforward as far as your role is concerned. His interrupt is easily soloable. You've Death Grip to interrupt most of the ad casts, though not all. And you want to tank him around where he is originally standing, because that's where the ads spawn around. Torches should be handled by a mobile ranged player, ideally. Otherwise, you could just use a melee player or an immobile ranged player who just isn't losing as much DPS to do it. In theory, you'd be decent for it, but you'd be moving the boss and getting worse cleave on the ads, so you'd probably just want to leave it to someone else, probably the healer. Other than the leaps from the boss ads and having casts go off from the ads, the main thing that is actually capable of killing people here is the boss AoE, either alone or in combination with other abilities. So, especially on tyrannical weeks, you can get some good anti-magic zone value here, because it is actually a dangerous source of AoE magic damage. If 3 or more ads are ever active at the same time, you might want to consider having your group focus on ads until you get them back under control, because things can snowball out of control very quickly if people aren't paying attention to the ads. It's not just the leap damage, you're just going to run out of stops eventually for all these channels, and then your whole party is going to get stunned. And this can especially be the case if your torch player misses an important clear and you have multiple ads revive at the same time. Beyond that, there are just a number of small nuances in this fight to mention that may or may not matter most of the time. First of all, while ads are starting to cast their ability, and during the wind-up even, not during the channel, they will not be healed by the Dread Essence AoE. So sometimes it is useful to delay interrupting their casts if an AoE is about to go off. Second, The boss sometimes has a Dread Essence queued up right after his kickable spell. So if you delay your kick, you can delay the Dread Essence cast, which can sometimes allow for an ad to begin casting their ability when they otherwise would not have had enough time to do so. Also, if you need to choose between killing an ad that you have no time to destroy its corpse with a torch and simply letting it heal, you'd much rather it heal just so you keep the threat. The ad keeps all of his debuffs and his cast will stay on cooldown for longer generally, because when they revive, the ability starts off of cooldown and they cast pretty quickly. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, general Mythic Plus questions, or if you'd like a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, is in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.